One. Observation of rural and urban trees in comparison. We have Zach, Nina, and Alyssa.
All right. So for the introduction, pretty much this project was collecting data of trees in both rural and urban environments. Four people collected data. That's me, Zach, Alyssa, and Kendrick. And each person collected one urban tree sample and one rural tree sample. What we looked at was the type of tree, the circumference of the tree, whether it was a healthy or unhealthy tree, how much surrounding impervious surface area there was, and how much lichen surface area was on the tree at both breast height and at 2 feet on the ground. And the purpose of this lab was to determine how the presence of impervious surfaces in the immediate surrounding area of a tree impacts their growth, health, and environmental circumstances. And our hypothesis is that trees in rural environments will have a larger circumference, more lichen, and be more frequently classified as healthy compared to urban trees.
And now we're going to go into the method slides. So first for methods, we did the field work. And with this project, we aimed firstly to investigate the lichen coverage, but also the tree growth and the effect of different environments on trees, as discussed, those being the rural and the urban environments. So the place that we conducted our study, it was at various locations, but it was no more than 15 minutes from campus. So we used locations such as Pullen Park, Cary Apartments, and in the Honors Village. To collect some of the data on the lichen coverage, we had to go to a rural area and then also the urban area, since there are different environments, and we had to select different trees to study. We then had to photograph our selected trees. It also showed the lichen coverage, obviously, in those pictures. And then we measured the steps we took around the tree that were impervious versus natural. So in the urban area, it allowed us to just kind of see how much was that impervious material being something like a sidewalk versus whenever we were in a more rural area, showing how much was grass and how there really wasn't much of that impervious surface around. And then while we were at the tree's location, we had to take different measurements of them, such as the height of them, their circumference, uh, with that also the diameter. And then we also did the lichen coverage in the directions of north, east, south, and west. So after we did the field work, we had to analyze all of our data, and we analyzed the data and collected it using Google Sheets. It was an easy way for us to compile all of our information from the different trees. And having four of us, the different trees gave us a little bit of a larger sample size rather than just one, and it was able to allow us to show the results better. And some of the main things we make graphs on and the data we compiled, it focused on the sizes of the trees, the numbers of the steps in relation to the environment, talking about the impervious versus the non-impervious. And also the lichen coverage was focused on specifically the total surface area of the tree that was covered in relation to the circumference.
So then we start getting into our rural versus urban and the tree lichen surface area. And it was a pretty distributed charts when it came to this. And we couldn't quite see a correlation because there were different trees, different areas. And that leads to the next slide where we talk about how lichens tend to grow on trees that are typically stressed and in decline rather than having a preference for a specific tree species. And so there isn't quite a correlation with the tree species and the percent of lichen. It just varies per tree species, the area they're in. And our data does not really point to lichen having something to do with the health of some of our trees. are healthy, and some of them have a lot of lichen, and some of them are unhealthy, and some do not have a lot of lichen. So it's just pretty evenly distributed. And something taken into consideration whenever we're doing this is that we didn't have a very large sample size. So we need to have a much larger sample size to be statistically accurate and have a really good solid study that can prove a statistical significance with lichen and the type of tree. And then another thing we looked at was the tree size with urban versus rural areas. And when we looked at it, the rural areas typically have almost by 75% have an average circumference that is way higher. And the bottom is like the average is 116 for urban and the rural is 293. And then why we get these results is because rural trees tend to be larger and healthier than urban trees. They have more room to grow. They usually have more natural nutrients. They have richer soil. They've been there for a longer period of time. They're not just transplanted there. And the rural area also is just has more species and can thrive better. And the urban environments have poor soil quality because there haven't been that many species. And there's a lot more pollution and restricted space. And the more stable a microclimate is in rural areas with less extreme temperatures and wind also benefits tree growth. And the more trees you have, the less extreme factors that would happen. And a quote that we cited was most urban trees had smaller trunk diameters than rural conspecifics of the same age. And then another thing we looked at was the health versus lichen coverage. So we looked at unhealthy trees, healthy trees, and we dictated what was healthy versus unhealthy by looking at the branches and seeing if the branches had cracks in them. If we looked at the leaves, seeing if anything was torn, if there was discoloration. Looking at the roots, seeing if anything was exposed, if there's any holes in the roots that openly don't seem like they'd be there. And especially the trunks, looking at possibly wounds, if it's bark chipped, if there are like a lot of missing pieces. So we found per our data that 3 out of the 4 trees per urban and rural were healthy. And then another thing we looked at was the rural tree total lichen coverage versus the urban tree lichen coverage. And this was a pretty even distribution whenever it came to this chart. And this also talks about whenever lichen tells us about tree health in general, we talk about how lichen is a bioindicator a lot, and that is because of the algae and fungi that make up lichen. And lichens act as an air quality monitor for trees. So if the lichen turns a specific color, it usually means there's a lot of pollution in the area, and it's a really good indicator to the tree health in the area, the other species health in the area. And their presence and abundance also indicates how clean the area around the tree is as well. And then while the lichen itself isn't harmful at all, its presence, like I said, can be an indicator of the tree health. Like I said, it's not harmful at all. And then although we have data for what should statistically happen that says that usually a different color lichen would indicate a more unhealthy tree, we're still unable to prove this original hypothesis due to a very low sample size of 4, which was the original problem with the other results, and we can't have a statistically accurate hypothesis to prove. And then one of the last things is whenever we're talking about the health of trees in rural versus urban, the urban and rural was about 3/4, and it was pretty even throughout with unhealthy versus healthy. And yeah.
So our data does not entirely support the hypothesis. There are pretty much 3 parts to the hypothesis. We did find that rural trees tend to have larger circumferences and that rural trees can have more lichen, but our results don't necessarily completely support the hypothesis. And what we hypothesized as rural trees being more frequently classified as healthy was not supported by our data because there was the same amount of healthy and unhealthy trees in both rural and urban areas. Something important to look at when discussing tree diameter in rural versus urban areas, there was a study that suggested that trees in cities grow at somewhat slower rates because of a significant portion of the roots being below the pavement. But the study also stressed that not all street trees are necessarily unhealthy or that they are going to die immediately based on the data. And in terms of the lichen that was on the trees, again, we can't necessarily say that it correlates to the health of the tree or the location of the tree. Lichen tend to need a lot of time to grow up their population on the tree. So because we didn't know the ages of the trees we were studying, this definitely plays a large part in how much lichen could be on it and is therefore a confounding variable. And in terms of the amount of healthy trees and unhealthy trees, they again were the same, and we were unable to fully understand why.
This is our literature cited. We came up with 5 different sources for our experiment, and that's it.
We're good. I think that was like 11 minutes, something.